So I'm now very pleased to introduce Sanya Nishtar, who I've known for many, many years. She is a cardiologist by training, became a Minister of Health in her own country, a public advocate for cardiovascular health, and most recently was one of 3 shortlisted candidates for the Director General's position in WHO, and that in itself, that shortlisting, is testimony to her international standing in the world of global health. And I could think of nobody better to give a keynote presentation at the end of this summit, and not least because in the course of her campaign, she visited heads of states and ministers of health from over 160 countries. And these are the very people that we are trying to influence. So what can we learn, Sanya, from your experience?
Good afternoon, CVD and NCD friends and colleagues. Let me begin by thanking the World Heart Federation for asking me to speak. It seems like being back to the family. I've served for a long time on its board, so I was delighted to have been invited. I also want to congratulate the World Heart Federation and David in particular for the clarity of vision, for the focus on action, because that is exactly what we need. I'm going to talk about 4 things today, and my frame of reference is going to be non-communicable diseases. Fiona actually challenged us to focus on the asks, so I'm going to focus on the asks. And I recommend that we focus on creating the right institutional arrangements, both at the international and country level, that we try and embed non-communicable diseases and cardiovascular diseases and in whatever is mainstream, because there is a huge opportunity to do that. I would recommend to you in all humility that we focus on comparative advantage and recognize what we are best at doing, because we clearly have a niche role here. And then the emphasis on accountability, because without which nothing can be achieved. To begin with, I cannot help saying, David, that I was so struck by your emphasis on failures. Because normally we go to meetings and we talk about replenishments and we're in a celebratory mood and we talk about what's next and what's we've achieved. And here, so many circulation-related societies and foundations come together, and the NCD community comes together, and we talk about failures. Why is that the case? Why is it the case that so many years after the political declaration on NCDs in 2011, we still have to talk about failures? After all, it was the second time that the heads of state and the global leaders of the world came together at UNGA to forge a consensus on a health issue for the second time in the history of the world. And the first time it happened for HIV/AIDS, there was a lot of momentum, and 5 years on, we're still talking about failures. Why is it that 2 years down the line, subsequent to 2015, where NCDs were squarely positioned as a target and goal 3 of the Sustainable Development Framework, we still have to talk about failures? Why is it the case that despite the evidence, there's clearly no dearth of evidence? We've got evidence about the global burden, we've got evidence about the social and the economic impact, we've got crystal clear evidence about what works. Circling back to Salim's excellent presentation yesterday, why is it that despite all that, we still have to talk about failures? You pick up any WHO country survey, and Etienne and Doug will bear me out. You pick up any country survey of countries' needs and assessments, and I'm privy to a lot of information as one of the 3 nominees, and non-communicable diseases will stand up as the first requirement of countries where they require technical assistance. And I have validated it with first-hand information, because as part of my candidature, I had the enormous privilege of meeting 191 country delegations, some of them at the head of state level, most of them, in fact, all of them at the Minister of Health level, and the foreign ministers and the foreign ministries as well. And do you know, to my surprise, I found out that non-communicable diseases was on top of their agenda. Of course, I used every opportunity to push non-communicable diseases and to create awareness, and because I'm part of your community as well. But in many parts of the world, I did not need to have mentioned it. And even the foreign ministers came, and in some instances, even the heads of state outlined that that was their foremost priority. I went to so many islands in the Caribbean region. I went to the Pacific region, the Middle East, Central Asia, Latin America, and that was the consistent message. Why is it this discord? Why is it that I continue to go to cardiovascular and diabetes and cancer meetings, and at global health meetings we talk about failures and the lack of funding and the lack of momentum, whereas at the level of countries there is a huge appetite and they recognize this as their foremost problem. And the reason why there is this discord, despite the political commitment as evidenced by the 2011 declaration, despite the compelling evidence and despite this huge appetite, the reason why this is the case is because we have set us up for failure as an international community. It is as plain, as simple as that. So let me take you back a little bit in history to reflect on why this is the case. Since the 1950s, which is when we coined the term tropical diseases, and from there onwards, whether we were talking about international health or global health, I don't want to get into the semantics of this. Whenever the world's health community has wanted an outcome, we have done a few things. We have created institutional arrangements, we have been clear about a unified strategy, and we have dedicated funding to that. And for NCDs, we have failed the world on all these three accounts. So let us take institutional arrangements, strategy, and funding one by one. When it comes to institutional arrangements, there is no global institution of the scale and of the construct and of the stature and with the funding that can mobilize and catalyze change. We have no Gavi or the Global Fund or UNAIDS for non-communicable diseases. It is as plain, as simple as this. And WHO's, despite the wealth of technical expertise within WHO, with all respect, I'd like to say that simply the leadership for NCDs, the appetite to lead on NCDs has just not been there for the past several years. Whenever we talk about a new institutional arrangement for NCDs, there is a pushback. There is a strong pushback, and I have tried several times. Back in 2005, I wrote a piece in The Lancet about the need for a new global arrangement for NCDs, and sorry for being a bit self-reflective. It is easiest to do that. Again, on the margins of the political declaration, it was done again in collaboration with a number of different colleagues, and again, a strong pushback. At some point in time, we have to realize that there has to be a strong global institutional construct to push non-communicable diseases. Now, there are pros and cons of housing that within WHO or outside of the World Health Organization. We all want a strong WHO. We all want to strongly support the new Director General and want to wish him all the best in his endeavors. But there are some critical questions to be asked by the NCD community. To what extent is there an appetite within the World Health Organization to exercise leadership for NCDs? To what extent does WHO's public governance structure and its non-exclusive mandate of standard setting work well to create that stakeholder mechanism which is required to lead on NCDs globally? We all know that the multi-stakeholder partnership-based construct has to be part of the global response to NCDs. And the question is, to what extent does WHO's governance mechanism and its standard setting function allow us to do that? Now, we know that a beginning has been made with the global coordinating mechanism. We know that the member states have agreed on the framework of engagement with non-state actors. And I think we need to, the new leadership has to ask itself and its membership and its technical experts some key questions about the extent to which it is ready to take on leadership for non-communicable diseases, because that will require engagement with the private sector. It will require getting them to the table. And I know that the kind of pushback that there is to enable that to happen when I was co-chairing the WHO Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity. So just to say that the need for a global institutional framework for non-communicable diseases is really urgent, it is really compelling, and part of the asks that the World Heart Federation, as indeed other civil society agencies might want to do, is to make that call once again. Secondly, when it comes to strategy, of course, the technical work is in-depth, it's broad-based, it is stellar, but what is the kind of message we're giving to countries? We talk to them about the Global Action Plan on NCDs. We talk to them about implementing FCTC, implementing DPAS, which is the Global Strategy on Diet and Physical Activity. We bring their attention to negotiated agreements on salt. We bring to their attention a number of different reports with strategies, with metrics, with a number of different actionable things to focus on. And it is confusing for member states. I mean, the member states are used to a very simple message and with money tied to it, and for NCDs, we're not just doing that. So we need a coordinated strategy, we need clear metrics, clear and simple metrics, and we need to peg that in, we need to have an international advocacy plan and some very clear communication around that. And I think there's some homework for at least the World Health Organization to do to unify their various strands, their technical strands, and negotiated pieces of work into simple messaging that will ring some bells in the Ministry of Health. Let's come to funding now. NCDs are competing, for instance, for attention with vaccination. And I'm just highlighting an example to you. The Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative goes to countries and the ministries of health with a very clear message. It goes to them with a fiscal envelope. It has a very clear ask. What do we do? What does the NCD community do? The NCD community goes to them asking them to impose fiscal measures, which technically is the right thing to do. This is something that I have myself pegged as a recommendation in the ECHO report, and I'm not questioning the merit of that, but I'm putting on my policymaker's hat in a country and looking at how it seems to them. So as opposed to Gavi and the clear messaging and the catalytic funding, we're asking them to impose fiscal measures, and we're pitting them against their parliaments, against their prime minister, and we're not even hand-holding them. And a lot of times when I was in countries for my candidature, this was repeated to me again and again. We need some help to do these things. We want the next Director General to be by our side when we are speaking to our parliaments, and you may have noticed that when I was making my closing speech, these were the kind of pledges that I made at the World Health Assembly. Now, I completely understand that the era of the MDGs and the SDGs are two very different animals, and the focus is very much on strengthening country institutions and systems so that the international agencies can focus on where their comparative advantage lies. And I do not disagree with that. I completely agree with that. I completely agree that we need to focus on domestic resource mobilization for NCDs and for health in general, but we need to make sure that IMF and the World Bank are speaking the same language to the countries, because currently they're not. And we need to make sure that we have some level of mix and balance between indigenous resource mobilization, donor catalytic funding, and private investments for NCD, which can also be mobilized. So there are these three missing elements at the international level, and my recent travels have validated the need to remedy them, because without remedying these, the kind of action that we envisage, the kind of action that we hope for, and the kind of action that evidence supports is not going to get up and running. Institutional arrangements, clarity of strategy and messaging, and the catalytic funding, at least from the international level. That's the first message I wanted to give. The second message I want to give is that there's a huge opportunity to embed non-communicable diseases even in the current frame of mainstream work that is up and running in countries. And let me just give you some granular examples to bring that to life. For instance, the NCD community talks about institutionalizing risk factor-based surveillance. Now, from my country experience, I know that we do not have to recreate another survey to do that. We could peg that onto existing social and living standards measurement surveys, or the demographic health surveys, or the multiple indicator cluster surveys, which are up and running in at least 100 countries of the world, which are population-based. But in order to do that, you need an international negotiator to make the case and to create the room for that in those surveys. For instance, most countries have national essential drug lists. It's a question of how you include NCD drugs in that. In many countries, investments in HIV and AIDS have created the primary healthcare infrastructure to ensure continuity of care. And all that we need to do is to leverage that experience, those tools, those strategies, and utilize them for chronic care. And again, some level of strategic thinking and planning is required. Some level of catalytic support is required to enable developing countries to leapfrog and to jumpstart and to make a head start in that direction. For example, health workers are trained, and in my own country, there's a field force of 100,000 lady health workers, and all we needed to do was to integrate blood pressure screening as part of the scope of their work. So there are social protection, for instance. In many countries, social protection and financial risk protection will provide coverage for cesarean sections and for deliveries, and all you need to do is to ensure that they start providing coverage for catastrophic costs that are NCD related as well. So at the barest minimum, we can start leveraging existing opportunities because they are huge, and we can even make a huge impact by doing that. But I do not envisage that without an international impetus, without an appropriate institutional arrangement, that can be enabled. And along the same vein, I think we should continue to emphasize that when it comes to universal health coverage, it is not just universal health coverage for deliveries and for cesarean sections. You're talking about comprehensive universal health coverage, which includes geographic and financial risk protection for NCDs as well. We can continue to make the point that in the access to medicines agenda, NCDs have a huge place. Sustainability, for instance, Katie Dane just talked about the 47 trillion economic losses projected until 2030, if I'm right. Is that not about sustainability? Are healthcare costs not a mainstream sustainability agenda? Do NCDs not qualify to be on mainstream tables on that account alone? And why do we forget to highlight that at the appropriate forum? What about innovation? I chair the World Economic Forum's Future Council on Innovation, and each and every innovation that we're talking about over there, I want to emphasize, each and every innovation that we talk about has NCDs at its cusp. So whether it is the new generation science and technology advancements in health, or whether it is digital health, where portability of data, wearable devices, and predictive analytics have created this huge space to impact individual behavior change. Those are all mainstream innovations centered around non-communicable diseases. I mean, I can just go on and on. The new payment systems and the new impact investments and all the innovations that are happening around process and the use of bitcoins and the rest of them. And I think that the NCD community needs to recognize that even given the limitations, even given the resource limitations, there's a huge opportunity to mainstream what we're talking about, but that is not going to happen without international leadership. And those are the kind of calls that we should be making. My fourth point, and just a one-liner, I think we should recognize where our comparative advantage lies. Let me put on the hat of the World Heart Federation's board member for a minute. I know what kind of power lies within this room alone. You are apex institutions of thousands of foundations and societies that have the leverage to mobilize policymakers in every corner of the world. And when I had the privilege of chairing the first World Heart Day Steering Committee, I recognized and I saw firsthand, and hats off to the management of the World Heart Federation at that time, I saw firsthand how a small fiscal envelope could cascade change strategically to the last corner of the earth, because you are networked, you have presence, and you have huge leverage, because your membership constituents, your physicians, are the ones who are treating the prime ministers and presidents in different parts of the world. And I think you should not lose sight of the comparative advantage, which is why the focus on specific messages, which is what I think the call will be wrapping up with, are so important. And lastly, accountability. I think that without accountability, we're not going to achieve anything in global health, nothing in global development, because we are in a habit of making promises. We are in a habit of making sweeping statements and coming up with policy pronouncement after policy pronouncement and strategy after strategy. There is no accountability of how we deliver on that. And I think one of the most important calls that should emerge from this forum, and indeed from any other forum, is to institutionalize meaningful, independent accountability. I just want to end by saying that the world is changing. We're looking at new paradigms in development. We're looking at a fundamental change in the global construct. There are a number of different challenges we're confronted with: ongoing conflicts, migration, the threat of pandemics. And we do not have to be apologetic about making a call for non-communicable diseases. When I went around the world as a candidate, I would always say in private meetings and in publicly, where I'm on record having said that the threats that threaten to wipe out the development gains of the last century, the impending threats are not just pandemics and not just antimicrobial resistance and climate change. It is also non-communicable diseases. And I don't think that we should be apologetic about making a call for non-communicable diseases. We should not be shy of being passionate about NCDs. Somebody talked about health justice and health rights, and I know that there are individuals from South Africa in the room. We should recall how the HIV/AIDS movement gained momentum there. It is when people started going to courts and started demanding access to treatment for antiretroviral treatments that the major change started getting institutionalized. It is when the civil society organizations took to street in different parts of the world that social protection programs started getting born. And I don't think that we should be shy of demonstrating our passion, of our commitment for NCDs. I think it is vital to do that. So thank you once again for having me at your table. Thank you once again for your interest in this area. I just want to leave the podium by reminding you that even in this room, there's a wealth of experience. You have a huge and enormous leverage to cascade change. And I think we must, as a starting point, leverage their comparative advantage. Thank you very much for having me here.